The wind howled across the vast Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the taste of dust and the promise of another scorching day. Samuel McKenna stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, squinting at the endless expanse of brown grass that stretched to the horizon. At 43, his face bore the deep lines of a man who'd spent too many years wrestling with this unforgiving land, and too many nights alone since Martha passed. It had been 3 winters now. 3 winters since the consumption took her, leaving him with nothing but 200 head of cattle, a creaking house, and the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest like a stone. The ranch hands helped with the work, sure enough, but they went home to their own families come sunset, leaving Samuel with only the coyotes' distant calls for company. He pulled the crumpled letter from his vest pocket, reading it for what must have been the dozenth time. The words from the matrimonial agency in Chicago promised discretion and suitable matches for frontier men seeking wives. Samuel's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man given to fanciful notions, but the practicality of it appealed to him. A ranch needed a woman's touch, someone to tend the garden, keep the house, maybe chase away the ghosts that seemed to lurk in every corner. Slim, obedient, and hard-working. He'd written in his requirements, his handwriting cramped and careful. Must be willing to endure frontier life. No frivolities or Eastern airs, between 25 and 35 years of age. In his mind, he could see her already, slight of build like Martha had been, with neat hands and a quiet demeanor. A woman who wouldn't complain when the well ran low or when blizzards trapped them inside for weeks. Someone who understood that out here. Survival came before sentiment. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth until it cracked like old leather. Samuel watched a dust devil dance across the pasture, remembering how Martha used to say they were spirits playing in the wind. He shook his head sharply, banishing the memory. There was no room for such softness anymore. The West had taught him that lesson well enough. His nearest neighbor, Tom Bradley, had laughed when Samuel mentioned the matrimonial agency. Mail-order bride, Sam, what's next? You gonna order your cattle from a catalog too? But Tom had Emma and 4 boys to keep his bed warm and his table full. He didn't understand the weight of empty rooms and silent suppers. Samuel turned back toward the house, his boots heavy on the wooden boards. Inside, everything remained exactly as Martha had left it. Her quilts on the beds, her dishes in the cupboard, even her apron still hanging on its hook by the stove. He'd told himself he kept things that way out of respect, but the truth was simpler. Changing anything would mean accepting she was truly gone. The letter from the agency said his bride would arrive within 2 months. 2 months to prepare the house, to ready himself for another woman's presence. He moved through the dim interior, noting what needed repair. The bedroom door hung crooked on its hinges. The iron bed frame squeaked something terrible, had done so for years, though Martha never complained. Several floorboards had worked loose, and mice had gotten into the pantry again. Outside, a hawk cried, riding the thermal currents high above the ranch. Samuel envied its freedom, its ability to simply spread wings and leave when things got too hard. But he was tied to this land as surely as if it had grown roots through his boots. His father had claimed this territory when it was nothing but Sioux country and dreams. His mother was buried on the hill behind the house, alongside Martha and the 2 babies that never drew breath. The ranch itself sprawled across 2,000 acres of mixed grassland and scrub. Good grazing when the rains came, which wasn't often enough. The cattle were hardy stock, Texas Longhorns crossed with Eastern breeds, built to survive on little water and tough grass. But even they suffered when drought struck, and Samuel had lost 30 head last summer to the heat. Wolves posed another constant threat. Just last week, he'd found one of his best heifers torn apart near the creek, her calf nowhere to be found. The wolves grew bolder each winter, driven down from the mountains by hunger. A woman alone in the house while he was out working. The thought gave him pause, but surely any woman willing to come west would understand the dangers. He spent the afternoon mending fence, his hands working automatically while his mind wandered. What kind of woman answered advertisements for frontier wives? Desperate ones. Probably. Women with no prospects back east, or those running from something. He'd specified respectable, but how could the agency truly verify such things? The sun was setting by the time he returned to the house, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. He heated beans and salt pork for supper, eating mechanically at the kitchen table. The empty chair across from him seemed to mock his solitude. Even the ranch dog, Rex, seemed to sense his master's mood, lying quietly by the stove instead of begging for scraps. That night, Samuel lay in the bed he'd once shared with Martha, staring at the ceiling. The bed frame groaned with every movement, its protests echoing through the empty room. He thought about his bride-to-be, this unknown woman who would soon share this space. Would she find the house too crude after Eastern comforts? Would the isolation drive her mad, as it had driven the Petersons' wife to take her own life last spring? He'd been clear in his letter about expecting a slim woman. It was practical. Really. Life out here demanded agility, climbing into wagons, mounting horses, squeezing through fence gaps to rescue stuck calves. A slight woman would manage better, require less food. And if he was honest with himself, Martha's delicate frame had always made him feel protective, needed. It was what a man wanted, someone to shelter from the harsh world. The coyotes began their nightly chorus, their yips and howls carrying across the empty land. Samuel closed his eyes, trying to imagine the sound of another person breathing beside him, the warmth of another body in the cold pre-dawn hours when frost painted the windows white. 2 months until his ordered bride arrived, slim and suitable, ready to fill the void in his practical life. But the West had a way of delivering the unexpected. As Samuel drifted towards sleep, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, unusual for the season. Change was coming. Whether he was ready or not, the land itself seemed to sense it, holding its breath beneath the vast canopy of stars. The train wheezed to a stop at Cedar Ridge Station, black smoke billowing into the crystalline morning air. Samuel McKenna stood on the platform, his best shirt starched stiff and uncomfortable against his sun-weathered neck. He'd arrived an hour early, pacing the wooden boards until the station master asked if he was feeling ill. Now, as passengers began to disembark, his palms grew damp despite the cool breeze. He watched them file past, traveling salesmen with their sample cases, a few ranch hands returning from cattle drives, a minister clutching his Bible. Then the stream slowed, and Samuel's chest tightened. What if she'd changed her mind? What if the agency had made some mistake? The conductor was checking his pocket watch when one final passenger appeared in the doorway. Samuel's breath caught, then escaped in something close to dismay. The woman struggling to navigate the narrow train steps with her worn valise was nothing like what he'd expected. Where he'd pictured a delicate wildflower, here stood a full-bloomed rose, curved and substantial, her traveling dress straining slightly at the seams. Margaret O'Brien, for this had to be her, paused at the top of the steps, scanning the platform. Her face was handsome rather than pretty, with strong features and eyes the color of storm clouds. Dark hair escaped from beneath her bonnet in unruly curls. When her gaze found his, she lifted her chin with a pride that made his stomach sink further. "Mr. McKenna?" Her voice carried the faint lilt of Irish ancestry, though her accent was pure Boston. "Miss O'Brien." He removed his hat, acutely aware of the station master watching from his window. I'll get your trunk." "Just the valise," she said, managing the last step with more grace than he'd expected for a woman of her build. "Everything I own is in it." The silence stretched between them as he took her bag, heavier than it looked. She wasn't fat, exactly, but Lord above. She was sturdy. Her shoulders were broad. Her arms looked strong beneath the fabric. And her hips. Samuel jerked his gaze away. Heat creeping up his neck. "The wagon's this way," he muttered, leading her around the station to where he'd left the buckboard. She climbed up without waiting for his assistance, settling her skirts with practiced efficiency. As he joined her on the seat, the wagon creaked ominously, and he found himself calculating whether the axles would hold for the 10-mile journey home. They rode in uncomfortable silence for the first mile. The only sounds, the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through the sage. Samuel could feel her presence beside him like a physical weight, so different from Martha's bird-like delicacy. He caught a whiff of her scent, lavender soap mixed with train smoke and something indefinably feminine. "The agency said you were a widower." Margaret finally spoke, her voice carefully neutral. "How long?" 3 years come winter. I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded curtly, keeping his eyes on the rutted road. "The agency said you were, that is, your letters indicated." He couldn't finish. Couldn't find a polite way to say you were supposed to be slim. "That I was 28 and seeking a new life in the West," she supplied evenly. "Both true, Mr. McKenna." The edge in her voice made him glance sideways. Her jaw was set, her gray eyes fixed on the horizon. She knew what he'd been trying to say. Of course she knew. They passed the Turner Ranch, where Ben Turner was mending fence with his boys. Samuel saw them stop working to stare, saw Ben's eldest nudge his brother and whisper something that made them both grin. By evening, every ranch within 20 miles would know that Sam McKenna's mail-order bride had arrived, and she was nothing like what he'd ordered. "It's a hard life out here," he said stiffly, feeling the need to fill the silence. "The agency explained that, I hope." They did. She shifted on the seat, and he felt the wagon sway slightly. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. McKenna, despite what you might think looking at me." The directness of it startled him. Eastern women, in his experience, danced around things, all gentle hints and downcast eyes. But then, nothing about Margaret O'Brien seemed gentle. "I wasn't," he began, then stopped. He had been thinking exactly that. "The agency had your requirements," she continued, her voice steady but with an undertone he couldn't identify. "Slim, obedient, hard-working. I suppose 1 out of 3 isn't what you hoped for." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "Miss O'Brien." "Mrs. McKenna, soon enough." She turned to look at him fully for the first time since leaving the station. "Unless you're planning to send me back on the next train?" The question hung between them like a challenge. He could, he supposed, claim the agency had misrepresented things, demand they find him someone more suitable. But the thought of the gossip, the humiliation of sending away a woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry him. "No," he said finally. We'll make do." She laughed then, a bitter sound that made him flinch. Make do. How romantic. The rest of the journey passed in strained silence. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Samuel heard her quick intake of breath. He tried to see it through her eyes, the weathered buildings, the endless brown grass, the isolation of it all. The house looked particularly shabby in the harsh afternoon light, its unpainted boards gray as old bones. "It's not much," he said defensively. "It's fine." But her voice had gone quiet, and when he glanced over, her face had lost some of its defiant strength. He pulled up in front of the house, setting the brake with more force than necessary. Rex came bounding from the barn, barking a greeting that turned uncertain as he caught the stranger's scent. "That's Rex," Samuel said unnecessarily. "He's harmless." Margaret climbed down from the wagon, again without waiting for help, and extended her hand for the dog to sniff. Rex's tail began to wag, and he pressed against her skirts, leaving dusty paw prints on the dark fabric. "Hello, boy," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "Aren't you a handsome fellow?" Something in Samuel's chest twisted at the gentle tone. Martha had used that same voice with animals, that soft crooning that seemed to calm even the wildest creatures. He carried her valise inside, acutely aware of her following behind, taking in the sparse furnishings, the bachelor untidiness he hadn't quite managed to hide. She paused in the doorway of the bedroom, and he saw her notice the narrow bed, the single pillow. "I'll sleep in the barn until after the ceremony," he said quickly. "The preacher comes through next Sunday. We can make it official then." She nodded, still surveying the room. And after? He hadn't let himself think that far ahead. Hadn't imagined sharing that creaking bed with anyone but Martha. Looking at Margaret's substantial frame, he wondered if the old mattress would even hold. "We'll work that out when the time comes," he said brusquely. "Are you hungry? There's beans and salt pork, some cornbread from yesterday." "I can cook," she said, moving past him toward the kitchen. "If you'll show me where things are." He watched her explore the space, opening cupboards, checking the stove, her movements efficient despite her size. She found Martha's apron on its hook and paused, her fingers hovering over the faded fabric. Was this hers? Yes. She left it hanging and rolled up her sleeves instead. "I'll need my own things, but this will do for now." As she worked, Samuel found himself backing toward the door, needing escape from this stranger who was suddenly filling up his house with her presence, her scent, her substantial reality. "I need to check on the herd," he said. "I'll be back by dark." She didn't turn from the stove. "I'll have supper ready." Outside, he breathed deeply, trying to clear his head. What had he done? What had possessed him to think he could simply order a wife like a plow from a catalog? And what was he supposed to do with this woman who looked nothing like what he'd wanted? Who spoke her mind and moved through his house like she belonged there? From the kitchen window, he could see her silhouette moving about, already making changes, already claiming space. His neighbors would laugh themselves sick. Sam McKenna, who'd been so particular about wanting a slim bride, had gotten himself a woman who could probably wrestle a calf to the ground single-handed. Rancher wanted a slim bride. He could already hear Tom Bradley saying, "Got himself a curvy one instead." The shame of it burned in his chest as he saddled his horse and rode out toward the upper pasture, fleeing the reality of what his loneliness had brought him. Behind him, smoke began to rise from the chimney. The first time in months the house had shown such signs of life. But Samuel didn't look back, couldn't bear to acknowledge that for all his disappointment. Something in that cold house had already begun to thaw. The first week passed like a slow-burning fuse, each day tighter with unspoken tension than the last. Margaret rose before dawn, her heavy footsteps on the floorboards jolting Samuel from sleep in his makeshift bed in the barn. By the time he entered the house, she'd have coffee brewing and breakfast started. Proper meals, not the hasty fare he'd grown accustomed to. But they ate in silence, the scrape of forks against plates louder than gunshots in the quiet. She worked harder than any woman he'd known, including Martha. Her strong arms kneaded bread dough without tiring, hauled water from the well without complaint, scrubbed the years of bachelor grime from every surface until the house gleamed. But Samuel found himself watching her with a mixture of admiration and resentment. Every efficient movement, every completed task seemed to mock his expectations. "I ordered a wife, not a workhorse," he'd muttered one evening, thinking she couldn't hear. Her hands had stilled over the mending in her lap. "Would you prefer a delicate flower who'd faint at the sight of blood when it's time to butcher chickens?" The words stung because they held truth. Already, she'd proven more capable than he'd anticipated. When he'd found her chopping wood one morning, swinging the axe with practiced ease, he'd felt something between shame and anger. "That's man's work," he'd said sharply. She'd embedded the axe in the chopping block with a solid thunk. So is cooking and cleaning, apparently, when a man lives alone. He'd stomped off to the barn, her logic trailing him like smoke. The worst part was the way she filled the house with her presence. Martha had been like a whisper, easy to overlook until she was gone. But Margaret was a shout, her humming while she worked, the swish of her skirts, the way she rearranged things to suit herself. She'd moved Martha's good dishes to a lower shelf, where they're actually useful, and he'd had to bite his tongue until it nearly bled. On the fourth day, she'd accompanied him to town for supplies. He dreaded it, knowing the stares and whispers that would follow them. Sure enough, Mrs. Henderson at the general store had looked Margaret up and down with barely concealed amusement. "So you're Samuel's bride," she'd said, her tone suggesting Samuel had ordered beef and received mutton. "How sturdy you look. Dear, you'll need to be out at that lonesome ranch. Margaret had smiled pleasantly. Indeed, I've always believed a woman should be built for the life she's meant to lead. Wouldn't you agree? The subtle implication that Mrs. Henderson, with her soft town life, was equally suited to her circumstances, had left the older woman speechless. Samuel had felt an unexpected flutter of appreciation before squashing it down, but the humiliation continued. At the feed store, Jack Morris had clapped Samuel on the shoulder. "Heard you got yourself a bride. Sam, bet she's a good cook, eh?" The meaningful look at Margaret's full figure had made Samuel's fists clench. "The best." Margaret had answered for him, her chin high. "A man works hard. He needs proper feeding." "Isn't that right, Mr. McKenna?" He'd mumbled agreement, hating how she turned their mockery back on them, hating more that he felt grateful for it. The strain reached its peak on Saturday night. Margaret had heated water for a bath, hanging a blanket across the kitchen for privacy. Samuel had tried not to think about her in the tub, tried not to notice the sounds of water sloshing, the soft humming of some Irish tune, but when she'd emerged, her face flushed from steam, dark hair damp and curling, wearing a nightgown that clung to her damp skin. He'd fled to the barn like a spooked colt. Sunday arrived with crystalline clarity, the sky so blue it hurt to look at. The preacher was due by noon, and Samuel found himself pacing the porch, dressed in his wedding clothes, the same ones he'd worn for Martha, smelling of cedar and regret. Margaret emerged from the house transformed. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, simply cut but flattering, with small pearl buttons down the front. Her hair was pinned up properly, revealing the strong line of her neck. She looked handsome, not beautiful in the delicate way he'd imagined, but striking in her own right. "You clean up well," she said, a tempting lightness. "You too," he managed, then winced at his gracelessness. They stood awkwardly, two strangers about to bind their lives together. The morning stretched taut between them until dust on the horizon announced Reverend Palmer's arrival. The ceremony was brief, witnessed by the Reverend's wife and Tom Bradley, who'd ridden over out of curiosity more than friendship. Samuel heard himself speaking the vows, felt the weight of the simple gold band as he slipped it onto Margaret's finger, the same ring Martha had worn, which seemed wrong somehow but was all he had. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Palmer intoned. Samuel leaned in, meaning to brush her cheek, but Margaret turned her face and their lips met briefly. Hers were softer than he'd expected, and warm. He pulled back quickly, disturbed by the unexpected flutter in his chest. Tom Bradley smirked. "Congratulations, Sam. May your marriage bed be sturdy." The crude jest made Margaret's face flame, but she kept her composure through the modest wedding lunch she'd prepared. Only Samuel noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. After the guests departed, the house felt smaller than ever. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers who didn't know the steps. As darkness fell, the question that had lurked all week demanded answer. "I suppose," Samuel began, then stopped, cleared his throat. "That is, you'll be wanting to move your things into the bedroom." Margaret stood by the stove, her back to him. "If that's what you want, it's what's expected," he said roughly. "We're married now." She turned then, and he saw something in her eyes. Fear, hurt, hope. It passed too quickly to identify. "Yes," she said quietly. "We're married." Later, lying in the bed that seemed to have shrunk by half. Samuel stared at the ceiling while Margaret settled beside him. The mattress dipped significantly under her weight, rolling him slightly toward the center. He grabbed the edge to keep himself in place, the bed frame groaning ominously. She lay perfectly still, barely seeming to breathe. The space between them might have been an ocean for all its vastness. Outside, a coyote howled, and Rex answered from the porch. The night sounds of the ranch continued, wind in the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle, but inside, silence reigned. "I know I'm not what you wanted," Margaret whispered into the darkness. The words hung there, a confession, an accusation, both. Samuel closed his eyes, wrestling with responses. Part of him wanted to deny it, to offer comfort, but the larger part, the part that still grieved for Martha, that still smarted from the town's amusement, couldn't form the lie. "We'll make do," he said finally, echoing his words from that first day. He felt, rather than heard her sigh, felt the minute shift as she turned away from him. The bed protested with a symphony of squeaks, and he found himself holding his breath, waiting for the final catastrophic crack that would send them both to the floor. But it held, groaning but steady, like everything else in his life. Not what he'd wanted, but surviving despite it all. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. He dreamed of Martha, slim and laughing, dancing away from him across endless grassland while behind him, something large and warm and infinitely patient waited in the shadows. The sandstorm struck without warning on a Tuesday afternoon. Samuel had been checking the eastern pasture when the sky turned an ominous yellow-brown, and the wind picked up with violent intent. He spurred his horse toward home, pulling his bandana over his nose and mouth as grit filled the air. By the time he reached the ranch, visibility had dropped to mere feet. The cattle were bellowing in distress, milling against the fence lines. Through the howling wind, he could barely make out the house, but what he saw made his blood freeze. Margaret was out by the barn, struggling to herd the milk cows inside. "Get to the house!" he yelled, but the wind tore his words away. She couldn't hear him, but she'd seen him. Instead of retreating to safety, she pointed urgently toward the chicken coop where the door had blown open. Hens scattering in panic, without hesitation, she plunged into the storm. Samuel cursed and dismounted, fighting his way to the coop. Together, they battled the wind to round up the birds, Margaret's strong arms proving invaluable as she grabbed the panicked chickens and tossed them inside. Her hair had come loose from its pins, whipping around her face like dark snakes, but she didn't pause. "The barn door!" she shouted directly into his ear. "It's coming loose!" They stumbled through the blinding sand to secure the barn. It took both of them throwing their combined weight against the door to get it closed and barred. Inside, the animals stamped nervously, and Samuel quickly checked. All accounted for, including his prize bull. Margaret was already moving, her practicality taking over. She grabbed empty grain sacks and started stuffing them along the bottom of the door where sand was already piling in. Samuel watched for a moment, struck by her quick thinking, before joining her effort. When they finally staggered into the house, they were both coughing, covered in dust. Margaret's dress was torn at the shoulder, and a small cut on her forehead bled sluggishly. Without thinking, Samuel reached out to touch it. "You're hurt." She jerked back slightly, surprised by the gesture. "It's nothing, just a scratch from flying debris," but he was already dampening a cloth, his movements gentle as he cleaned the wound. She stood still, and he became acutely aware of their closeness, the warmth radiating from her exerted body, the way her breath stirred the hair at his temple. "Thank you," he said gruffly, stepping back. "For the animals. You did well." Something flickered in her gray eyes. "They're my animals too now, aren't they?" The storm raged for hours. They sat at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and listening to the wind batter the walls, without the usual ranch work to create distance between them. Conversation came haltingly. "Where did you learn to handle livestock?" Samuel asked. "My uncle had a small farm outside Boston. I spent summers there as a girl." She smiled slightly. "He used to say I was built for farm work. Meant it as an insult, I think, but I took it as preparation." "Why did you answer the advertisement?" The question had plagued him for weeks. Margaret's hands tightened around her cup. "My parents died of influenza 2 years ago. My brother inherited everything, the house, the money, father's business. Edward's wife made it clear I was a burden, too old to marry well, too—" She gestured at herself with bitter humor. "Substantial to attract suitors willing to overlook my lack of dowry." Samuel felt an unexpected kinship. He understood being alone, understood the desperation that drove people to dramatic choices. "So, you came west." "So I came west," she agreed. "To a man who wanted a slim, obedient wife." The words held no accusation, just weary fact. "I shouldn't have said that," he admitted. "About the workhorse. But you thought it." He couldn't deny it. "Yes," she nodded, seeming to appreciate the honesty. "At least you don't pretend otherwise. That's more than most would offer." The storm began to die as evening approached. When they ventured outside to assess the damage, they found several fence posts down and half the chicken coop's roof torn away. Without discussion, they set to work side by side. Margaret held posts steady while Samuel hammered, handed him tools before he asked, anticipated needs with surprising accuracy. As the sun set, painting the dust-hazed sky in shades of amber, Samuel's horse stumbled in a hidden hole. He went down hard, his knee twisting painfully beneath him. Stars burst across his vision as pain shot up his leg. "Samuel!" Margaret was beside him instantly, her strong hand surprisingly gentle as she helped him sit up. "Don't try to stand yet. Let me look." She probed his knee with careful fingers, her touch clinical but tender. "Not broken, I think, but you've wrenched it badly. Can you make it to the house if I support you?" Pride warred with practicality. The house seemed miles away, and his knee screamed with every movement. "I can manage," he gritted out. Trying to rise, he made it 3 steps before nearly falling again. Without a word, Margaret ducked under his arm, taking his weight against her solid frame. She was exactly the right height, her strength evident as she practically carried him the remaining distance. "Martha couldn't have done this," he found himself saying, then immediately regretted it. Margaret's jaw tightened. "No, I suppose she couldn't have." Over the following days, as his knee slowly healed, Samuel experienced the strange reversal of being cared for. Margaret managed the ranch work he couldn't do, milking cows, feeding stock, even riding out to check the herd. She came back windblown and triumphant, reporting on new calves and mended fences. "That's too much for a woman," he protested from his enforced seat by the fire. She fixed him with a steady gaze. "Would you rather lose cattle? Or perhaps you'd prefer I fetch Tom Bradley to help?" I'm sure he'd enjoy telling everyone how Samuel McKenna's too sturdy wife had to call for assistance while her husband sat idle. The thought of further humiliation silenced him. He watched her work, noting the efficiency of her movements, the way she handled the animals with firm confidence. When she thought he wasn't looking, she'd pause to stretch her back or massage her shoulders. But she never complained. One afternoon, Billy Henderson and his sister Emma stopped by with their mother's regards and a basket of preserves. Samuel watched from the porch as Margaret charmed the children, letting Billy help with the chickens while braiding Emma's hair. Her laughter rang across the yard, rich and genuine. "Your wife's real nice, Mr. McKenna," Emma said shyly. "Not like Ma said. Ma said she was too big, but I think she's pretty, like a painting of a goddess we saw in a book." Out of the mouths of babes. Samuel saw Margaret's face flush, but she smiled at the girl. "That's kind of you to say, sweet pea." After they left, Margaret stood in the yard, watching their wagon disappear. "Children see clearer sometimes," she murmured, more to herself than him. That night, as she helped him navigate the stairs to bed, Samuel felt the shift in how he saw her. Not the delicate bird he'd wanted, but something else, a hawk perhaps, fierce and strong and built for survival in this unforgiving land. When she eased him onto the bed, her hands gentle on his injured knee, he caught her wrist. "Margaret, thank you for everything these past days." She stilled, looking down at him with those storm-gray eyes. "It's what wives do, Samuel, even wives who aren't what their husbands ordered." There was no bitterness in it now, just a kind of sad acceptance. She pulled free and busied herself with removing his boots. But something had changed in the space between them. Not love, not yet, but perhaps the first crack in the wall he'd built around his expectations. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, and Samuel thought about predators and prey, about strength and survival, about the different kinds of protection a man might need. His knee throbbed, reminding him of his vulnerability, of how quickly the tables could turn in this harsh land. And for the first time since Margaret had stepped off that train, he found himself genuinely grateful she was exactly who she was, sturdy, capable, and strong enough to hold him up when he couldn't stand alone. The trouble came on a moonless night in late October. Samuel woke to the sound of horses, too many horses for honest folk at this hour. He slipped from bed, reaching for the rifle he kept nearby, trying not to wake Margaret. But she was already sitting up, alert as any frontier woman learned to be. "How many?" she whispered. 3, maybe 4 riders. He was already pulling on his boots. "Stay inside. Bar the door behind me." "Like hell," she muttered, rolling out of bed and reaching for her own clothing. "Margaret, you think I survived Boston's rough streets to cower inside while my husband faces thieves alone?" She was already loading the shotgun they kept in the kitchen. "Besides, they're after the horses. Your prize stallion's worth 3 months' income." Before he could argue further, a shout split the night. "McKenna, we know you're in there. Come out nice and peaceful like, and nobody gets hurt." Samuel recognized the voice. Jake Morrison, a rustler who'd been plaguing the county for months. Through the window, he could see torches moving near the barn. "They're going for the horses," Margaret breathed. "The barn's too far from the house. They'll have them out before we can stop them." She was right. By the time they reached the barn, the horses would be gone. Unless... "Can you shoot?" he asked. "Well enough to make them think twice." They slipped out the back door, using the darkness for cover. Samuel's heart pounded as they crept along the side of the house. He could see the rustlers now, 4 of them, working to open the barn doors while keeping watch on the house. "I'll circle around," he whispered. "When I give the signal." A shot cracked through the night, splintering wood inches from his head. They'd been spotted. "So much for surprise," Margaret said grimly. And then she was moving. Samuel had never seen anything like it. She didn't run or panic. She strode forward like an avenging angel. Shotgun raised. "That's far enough, boys," her voice carried across the yard with surprising authority. "First man who touches that barn door gets a belly full of buckshot." The rustlers laughed. Well, McKenna's got himself a guard dog. A big one, too." "Better than a lapdog." She shot back. "Now step away from our property before I decide to test whether you bleed as red as honest folk." Samuel used her distraction to flank the group, but Morrison was no fool. He spotted the movement and fired, the bullet catching Samuel's shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Pain exploded through him, hot and sharp. "Samuel!" Margaret's cry pierced the night. "Got your man! Woman!" Morrison jeered. "Now be smart and go back inside. Let us take what we came for." What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for years to come. Margaret O'Brien McKenna, all 5 feet 8 inches and solid muscle of her, charged. Not in panic or hysteria, but with the calculated fury of someone who'd found something worth fighting for. Her first shot took Morrison's hat clean off, sending him diving for cover. She worked the shotgun's action smoothly, laying down covering fire as she moved to stand over Samuel's fallen form. "You want these horses?" she roared. "Come through me!" Maybe it was the sight of her, hair wild, eyes blazing, built like a Valkyrie from those old Norse tales. Or maybe it was the deadly accuracy of her shots. But the rustlers hesitated, and in that hesitation, their courage broke. "It ain't worth it, Jake," one called out. "She's crazy." "Crazy accurate," Margaret corrected, putting a shot so close to the speaker's boots that he danced backward. "My father was a Union sharpshooter, taught me everything he knew. Want to test if I inherited his eye?" It was a lie. Samuel knew her father had been a Boston merchant, but the rustlers didn't. They were already backing toward their horses, Morrison cursing but following. "This ain't over, McKenna," he shouted as they mounted up. "Yes, it is," Margaret replied steadily. "Because if I see any of you on our land again, I won't aim to miss." They rode off in a thunder of hooves and wounded pride. Only when the sound faded did Margaret drop to her knees beside Samuel, the shotgun falling from suddenly trembling hands. "Oh God, you're shot! Samuel, can you hear me?" "I hear you," he groaned, trying to sit up. The movement sent fresh fire through his shoulder. "Did they? The horses?" "Safe, all safe." Her hands were gentle but sure as she examined the wound. "Bullet went clean through. You're lucky. But we need to stop this bleeding." She half carried, half dragged him into the house, her strength the only thing keeping him upright. As she worked to clean and bind the wound, Samuel studied her face in the lamplight. There was blood on her cheek, his or hers. He couldn't tell. Her hands were steady, but he could see the fear she was mastering, the determination that drove her. "You lied," he said as she tied off the bandage. "About your father." "Yes." She didn't look up. "But they didn't know that. You could have been killed." Now she did meet his eyes. "So did you think I'd stand by and watch it happen?" "Most women would have. I'm not most women." She sat back on her heels, exhaustion suddenly showing. "I thought we'd established that. I'm too big, too strong, too much of everything you didn't want. Margaret. But I'm also the woman who just saved your horses and probably your life." There was no boast in it, just tired fact. "I'm the woman who chose to stand and fight instead of run, because that's what you do when—" She stopped, biting her lip. "When what?" "When you care about something. Someone." The words came out barely above a whisper. "Even if they wished you were someone else." Samuel reached out with his good arm, catching her hand. It was rough with work, strong and capable. Not the delicate bird's wing he'd imagined, but the hand that had held a shotgun steady, that had fought for him and their home. "I was a fool," he said quietly. She tried to pull away, but he held on. "Samuel, you're hurt. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying. I wanted a slim wife because I thought that's what I needed. Someone delicate to protect. But this land—" He gestured weakly with his wounded arm. "This land doesn't care about our fool notions. It demands strength, partnership, someone who can stand beside you when the wolves come calling, literal or otherwise." Tears tracked down her cheeks, the first he'd seen from her. Don't say things you don't mean just because you saved my life, because you've worked yourself raw to prove your worth, because you faced down 4 armed men like some warrior goddess." His voice grew stronger. "Margaret O'Brien McKenna, you broke every expectation I had. Thank God for it." She laughed through her tears, a watery sound. "Warrior goddess. Emma Henderson said something similar. Smart girl." He tugged her hand. "Help me up. We should check the animals, make sure they're calm." "You're going nowhere with that shoulder." "Then stay here with me." He kept hold of her hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the life pulsing through it. "Stay and let me start seeing you, really seeing you, for the first time." Outside, dawn was breaking across the prairie, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the barn, horses nickered softly, safe and sound. The rustlers were gone, driven off by a woman who'd refused to be what anyone expected. Weak, helpless, slim. Margaret squeezed his hand gently, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Samuel felt like he was finally home, not in the house he'd shared with Martha's ghost, but in the presence of this remarkable woman who'd fought for him, for their life together, with everything she had. "Your shoulder needs rest," she said finally, but she didn't let go of his hand. "Then rest with me," he said. "We've both earned it." As she helped him back to bed, Samuel marveled at how wrong he'd been. He'd wanted a delicate flower for the harsh frontier. Instead, he'd gotten a force of nature and discovered that's exactly what survival required, what love required, though he wasn't quite ready to name it yet. But as Margaret settled beside him, her solid warmth more comforting than any delicate beauty could ever be, he thought that recognition might not be far off. The West had a way of stripping away foolish notions, leaving only what was real and true and strong enough to last. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year, earlier and fiercer than anyone in Cedar Ridge could remember. The first blizzard struck in early November, turning the world into a white wasteland overnight. Samuel woke to find snow drifted halfway up the door, the windows frosted solid, and an ominous quiet that meant they were well and truly trapped. "At least we stocked the root cellar well," Margaret said, surveying their situation with her usual practicality. She'd been up before him, as always, stoking the fire until the kitchen glowed with warmth. Samuel's shoulder still ached from the bullet wound, though it had healed cleanly thanks to her care. He watched her move about the kitchen, noting how she'd learned to navigate the small space, how she ducked automatically at the low beam near the pantry. The house that had once seemed too small for her presence now seemed to fit her perfectly, or perhaps they'd both adjusted to fit each other. The storm raged for 3 days. They passed the time with necessary tasks, mending harnesses, patching clothes, Margaret teaching Samuel to knit socks while he taught her to whittle. The forced proximity should have been suffocating. But instead, Samuel found himself treasuring these moments of quiet companionship. "Tell me about Boston," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, snow hissing against the windows. Margaret's hands stilled over her sewing. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. Your childhood, your family, how you came to be." He gestured vaguely, then caught himself. "How you came to be so strong?" She smiled, a rueful twist of lips. "You mean how I came to be so large?" "That's not what I meant, but it's part of it." She set down her sewing, gazing into the fire. "I was always big, even as a child. My mother despaired, tried everything to make me delicate, corsets so tight I couldn't breathe. Tiny portions at meals while my brothers ate their fill, dancing lessons where I towered over every partner." Samuel felt a flash of anger at people he'd never met. "That's cruel. That was life for a woman who didn't fit the mold." She shrugged. "Father was kinder. He saw I'd never be a society belle, so he taught me what he taught my brothers: mathematics, business, how to shoot. If you can't be ornamental, Maggie, he'd say, be useful. And you became both." She looked at him sharply, searching for mockery, but found only sincerity. "You're still feverish from that wound, saying such things. My shoulder's fine. My eyes are finally working properly." He leaned forward. "That first day, when you stepped off the train, all I could see was what you weren't. I couldn't see what you were. And what am I?" The question came out barely above a whisper. Before he could answer, a loud crack split the air. They both jumped, then heard the ominous groan of timber under stress. "The barn roof," Samuel said, already reaching for his coat. "The snow, wait, you're not going out in this." Margaret was already pulling on her own heavy clothes. "Not with that shoulder. You can't go alone. Watch me." But her eyes softened. "I'll tie a rope from the porch to the barn. If I'm not back in 20 minutes, follow it." He wanted to protest, but she was right. His shoulder couldn't handle the work needed. So he waited by the window, barely able to see her silhouette through the driving snow, counting every second. She made it to the barn, and he could hear the scrape of a shovel on the roof. For 15 agonizing minutes, he watched her dim form battle the elements, clearing snow to save their livestock. When she finally stumbled back inside, lips blue and shaking with cold, he wrapped her in blankets and held her close to the fire. "Stubborn woman," he muttered into her hair. "Stubborn man," she countered through chattering teeth. "Would have gone out with a bad shoulder and gotten yourself killed." They stayed like that, her back against his chest, his arms around her, sharing warmth. Outside, the storm howled its fury, but inside, something had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained even after the rustler incident had collapsed like the snow from the barn roof. "I was so angry when you arrived," Samuel admitted quietly. "Not at you, not really, at myself. for being lonely enough to write to that agency, for having needs I couldn't fill alone. You were proof of my weakness." Margaret was quiet so long he thought she might have dozed off. Then, I was angry too, at a world that told me I was wrong for being strong, at my brother for making me feel like a burden, at you, for wanting something I could never be. She paused. At myself, for hoping anyway. Hoping for what? That someone might see me and not wish for something different. Her voice broke slightly. That I might be enough, just as I am. Samuel tightened his arms around her. You're more than enough. You're... He struggled for words. When those rustlers came, when you stood over me with that shotgun, ready to fight the whole world, I've never seen anything more magnificent. She turned in his arms to face him, eyes searching his. You mean that? Every word. He cupped her face gently. I was a fool to want some frail flower. What I needed, what I got, was a partner, someone who could match this land's strength with her own. Samuel. But whatever she meant to say was lost as he kissed her. Properly this time, not the awkward brush of lips from their wedding. She made a soft sound of surprise, then melted against him, her hands coming up to frame his face. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, she laughed shakily. The house is going to be shocked. The rancher who wanted a slim bride, kissing his sturdy wife like that. Let them talk. He rested his forehead against hers. They don't know what we know. And what's that? That sometimes you don't get what you think you want. You get what you need. He smiled. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you learn they're the same thing. The storm continued through the night, but they barely noticed, too caught up in this new understanding between them. They talked until their voices grew hoarse, sharing dreams and fears, laughing over his terrible attempts at knitting, planning improvements for the ranch come spring. When they finally made their way to bed, the old frame creaking under their combined weight, it felt different. Not like two strangers sharing space, but like two halves finding their fit. Samuel pulled Margaret close, marveling at how perfectly she curved against him, how her strength complemented his own. I have a confession, she murmured against his chest. That first night, I was terrified the bed would collapse. Seemed like it would be the perfect ending to my humiliation. He chuckled, feeling the vibration through both their bodies. It's held this long, though we should probably reinforce it come spring. Or get a new one, a proper one, built for... She hesitated. For us, he finished firmly. Built for us. Outside, the wind began to die, the storm finally exhausting itself. By morning, they'd be digging out, tending stock, returning to the endless work of ranch life. But for now, in the warm cocoon of their bed, none of that mattered. Samuel pressed a kiss to Margaret's temple, feeling her smile against his skin. He'd written to an agency wanting a slim, obedient wife. Instead, he'd gotten Margaret, strong, stubborn, magnificent Margaret. The West had a way of teaching hard lessons. And this was perhaps the best one, that what we think we want and what we truly need are rarely the same. As sleep finally claimed them, the bed creaked one more time, as if in agreement. It would hold, as they would hold to each other, through whatever storms might come. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the ranch into a paradise of wildflowers and sweet grass. Samuel had never seen the land look so alive, though he suspected it had less to do with the weather and more to do with the woman humming in the kitchen garden. Dirt on her hands and sunshine in her hair. The change in their marriage had been like the spring itself, gradual, then sudden, where once they'd moved around each other like wary strangers. Now they moved together like dancers who'd found their rhythm. Samuel would catch himself watching Margaret throughout the day, still amazed by the warmth that bloomed in his chest at the sight of her. You're staring again, she called out, not looking up from the tomato plants she was setting. Just wondering how I got so lucky, he called back, grinning when she laughed. Lucky? Yesterday you said I was stubborn as a mule when I insisted on moving the chicken coop. Lucky and stubborn aren't mutually exclusive. He walked over to join her, noting with pleasure how she leaned into him when he wrapped an arm around her waist. "Besides, you were right. The new spot gets better morning sun." It was a Tuesday evening when everything changed again. They'd spent the day working on the new addition to the house, an extra room they'd been planning since winter. The work was hard but satisfying, and they'd celebrated progress with a bottle of wine Tom Bradley had gifted them, claiming it was payment for the entertainment value of watching Sam eat crow about his bride requirements. They were laughing about Tom's latest mishap with the ornery bull when they made their way to bed, pleasantly tired and slightly tipsy from the wine. Samuel was pulling off his boots when Margaret sat on the bed, and the ominous creak that had become so familiar suddenly became something more. "Did you hear?" Margaret began, just as a spectacular crack split the air. The ancient bed frame, which had weathered years of use and months of their combined weight, finally gave up its struggle. The side rail split clean through, and the whole structure tilted dramatically, sending them both rolling toward the center in a tangle of limbs and startled laughter. For a moment, they lay still in the wreckage, processing what had happened. Then Samuel started to chuckle. The chuckle became a laugh, and soon he was roaring with mirth, holding his sides. "Samuel McKenna!" Margaret tried to sound scandalized, but she was fighting her own laughter. "This isn't funny." "Isn't it?" he gasped between laughs. "Rancher wanted slim bride, got a curvy one who broke his bed instead. That did it." Margaret's composure cracked, and she dissolved into giggles, burying her face in his shoulder. "Oh, Lord, the whole town will hear about this. We'll never live it down." "Let them hear." Samuel pulled her close, both of them still shaking with laughter. "Let them know that Samuel McKenna's wife is so magnificent, so absolutely perfect that she broke his bed, and he couldn't be happier about it." Margaret raised her head to look at him, eyes bright with mirth and something deeper. "You mean that? Even the broken bed part?" "Especially the broken bed part." He tucked a curl behind her ear. "Though I think it was both of us that did it in... That wine made us a bit enthusiastic." She blushed prettily. "Samuel McKenna. What would the town say? Probably that it's about time." He grew more serious, cupping her face. "Margaret, these past months, I was so blind, wanting something I thought I needed instead of seeing what was right in front of me. You're not what I ordered. You're what I never knew I desperately wanted." "Oh, Samuel," her eyes filled with tears. "That first day, I saw only what you weren't. Now, all I see is what you are. Strong, beautiful, brave, funny, currently lying in a broken bed." She added with a watery laugh. "In our broken bed," he corrected, "which we'll replace with a stronger one, built for the life we're building together." They carefully extracted themselves from the wreckage, still giggling whenever a board creaked or shifted, working together. They managed to drag the mattress onto the floor, creating a makeshift bed that would have to do until they could get to town. "Tom Bradley will have a field day," Margaret said as they settled onto their floor bed. "I can hear him now. Heard you two broke the bed. Sam, must be all that good cooking making you both hearty. Or he'll say something worse." Samuel agreed. "But I don't care. Do you?" Margaret considered this, then shook her head. "No, let them talk. They've been talking since I arrived anyway. At least now they'll have something true to gossip about." "And what's the truth?" She rolled to face him, her expression tender in the moonlight streaming through the window. "That Margaret O'Brien came west to marry a stranger who wanted a slim bride, and somehow found a man who learned to love her exactly as she is, broken beds and all." "That's not the whole truth," Samuel said softly. "Oh? You left out the part where the fool rancher realized his curvy bride was the best thing that ever happened to him, where he thanked God every day for sending him exactly what he needed instead of what he asked for. That's a good addition to the story," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There's more," Samuel continued, pulling her close, "about how she saved his ranch from rustlers, nursed him through injury, kept him sane through a brutal winter, and showed him that strength comes in many forms, and the strongest thing of all is love. "Now you're just making me cry," she protested, but she was smiling through her tears. "Good tears. The best tears." She kissed him softly. Though we should probably add that the rancher was pretty wonderful too. The way he learned to see past his expectations. How he opened his heart even when it scared him. "We make a good story." Samuel agreed. The best story, even if it did end with a broken bed. "End?" Samuel laughed. "Oh, my darling Margaret, this isn't the end. This is just the beginning. We've got a ranch to run, a house to expand. Maybe some little ones to fill it with." "Little ones?" Margaret's breath caught. "You want children, even if they might be sturdy like their mother?" "I hope they are," Samuel said firmly. "I hope they're strong and brave and magnificent, just like you. I hope they never apologize for taking up space in this world. And I hope they know that being exactly who they are is more than enough." Margaret was crying in earnest now, and Samuel kissed away her tears, marveling at how much had changed since that day at the train station. He'd wanted a slim, quiet wife to fill an empty space in his life. Instead, he'd gotten Margaret, loud, strong, space-filling Margaret, who hadn't just filled the empty spaces but had expanded his whole world. "I love you," he said, the words coming easily now. "My curvy, bed-breaking, rustler-fighting, absolutely perfect wife. And I love you," she replied. "My stubborn, wonderful, finally sees clearly husband." They lay together on their makeshift floor bed, planning their trip to town for lumber, laughing about the looks they'd get when they asked for reinforced bed frames. The broken bed had become something more than just failed furniture. It was a symbol of expectations shattered and rebuilt, of a love strong enough to break through barriers and prejudices. Outside, a nightingale began to sing, its melody carrying across the spring air. Samuel held Margaret close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, and thought about the mysterious ways of Providence. He'd written a letter asking for one thing and received something entirely different. The West had taught him many lessons, but perhaps this was the most important. Sometimes what breaks needs to break, so something stronger can be built in its place. And as he drifted off to sleep beside his magnificent wife on their temporary floor bed, Samuel couldn't imagine wanting anything other than exactly what he had. Tomorrow, the town would gossip. Let them. He'd wear their amusement like a badge of honor. After all, not every man was lucky enough to have a wife worth breaking furniture for. The sun rose over the McKenna ranch on a morning that promised to be like any other. Yet Samuel knew everything had changed. 5 years had passed since Margaret stepped off that train, and the transformation was evident in every corner of their expanded home, every flourishing garden bed, every fat calf in the pasture. But nowhere was the change more apparent than in the woman herself, standing at the stove making breakfast while 2 small children played at her feet. Little Martha, 3 years old with her mother's dark curls and sturdy build, was carefully stacking wooden blocks. Baby James, barely walking, clutched his mother's skirts with chubby fists. "Martha, sweetheart, move back from the stove," Margaret said without turning around, that mysterious maternal instinct alerting her to danger before it happened. Samuel watched from the doorway, his heart full. The town that had once whispered about his poor choice now spoke of the McKennas with respect and not a little envy. Margaret had become the woman neighbors called when children were sick, when births were difficult, when strength and compassion were needed in equal measure. "Papa!" Martha spotted him and abandoned her blocks, running into his arms. She was solid, this daughter of theirs, built like her mother and twice as determined. "Morning, little bear," he said, swinging her up. "Helping Mama. I'm making a house like ours," Martha announced proudly. "Only bigger, for when James gets big like me." Margaret turned, smiling at the sight of them. 5 years of ranch life had burnished her skin golden, added lines around her eyes from laughter. But she was more beautiful to him now than any slim society bride could ever be. "Tom Bradley's coming by today," she said, plating eggs and bacon. Something about organizing a barn raising for the Youngs. And he wants you to head up the women's committee, Samuel guessed. Probably. Mary Young's still weak from the baby. Margaret set the plates down and scooped up James, who was starting to fuss. I'll need to check on her anyway. This was their life now, woven into the fabric of the community, respected and valued. The woman once mocked for her size was now the one everyone turned to in crisis, her strength a blessing rather than a curiosity. After breakfast, they worked together as they always did, Margaret as capable with a branding iron as she was with a bread pan. The children played nearby, always under their watchful eyes. Martha showed early signs of her mother's fearlessness, while James seemed to have inherited Samuel's quieter nature. Remember when you worried the ranch work would be too much for a woman? Margaret teased as they mended fence together. I was an idiot, Samuel admitted readily. Though in my defense, I'd never met a woman like you. Lucky for you. The agency didn't send what you ordered. He caught her hand, pulling her close despite the sweat and dirt of honest work. The luckiest mistake of my life. That evening, the Bradleys joined them for supper, along with the Hendersons and the new schoolteacher, Miss Patterson. The house that had once seemed too small now rang with laughter and conversation. Margaret moved between kitchen and dining room with grace, managing children and guests with the same competence she showed with cattle and crops. You've done well for yourself, Sam, Tom Bradley said quietly as they stood on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset. Got to hand it to you when Margaret first arrived. I thought... You thought I'd gotten swindled, Samuel finished. You and everyone else. We were fools. Tom shook his head. That woman of yours is worth 10 of those delicate flowers back east. The way she helped during the drought last year, organizing the water sharing, keeping everyone's spirits up, and when those rustlers came back that second time. Samuel smiled at the memory. Morrison's gang had indeed returned, with more men and meaner intentions. But they'd found Margaret ready with half the county's women, all armed and trained by her in a ladies' shooting club. That was really a frontier defense league. She's something special, Samuel agreed. The children are lucky. Tom continued. Growing up with parents who see each other true, not everyone gets that. Later, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Samuel found Margaret on their new bed, a massive oak creation built by the finest carpenter in 3 counties, guaranteed to last generations. She was letting down her hair, the lamplight catching the silver threads among the dark. Tired? He asked, sitting beside her. The good kind of tired. She leaned into him, the kind that comes from a full life. Any regrets? It was a question he asked sometimes, still amazed by the answer. Only one, she said, and his heart skipped until he saw her smile. I regret we didn't break that old bed sooner. Think of all the time we'd wasted being careful around each other. He laughed, pulling her close. We made up for it. That we did. She was quiet for a moment. Do you ever think about what would have happened if the agency had sent what you asked for? Some slim little thing who'd have fainted at the first sight of a rattlesnake? We'd have been miserable, Samuel said without hesitation. I'd have spent my life protecting someone who didn't need protection, missing out on having a true partner, missing out on you. Sweet talker, she accused, but her eyes were soft. Truth teller, he corrected. Margaret McKenna, you broke my bed and rebuilt my life. You showed me that strength isn't about size or shape, but about heart and spirit. You gave me children who'll grow up knowing their worth isn't measured by what others expect, but by who they choose to be. We gave each other that, she said softly. You saw past your disappointment to find who I really was. Not every man would have done that. Not every woman would have stayed to let him try. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing, coyotes singing, the wind through the cottonwoods. It was a hard life still. Would always be hard out here on the frontier. But it was their life, built on broken expectations and strengthened by truth. The preacher's wife asked me today if I'd speak to her daughter. Margaret said eventually. "The girl's being courted by some boy who thinks she's too tall, too strong-minded, wants her to try to make herself smaller. What will you tell her?" Margaret's smile was fierce and beautiful. "I'll tell her about a rancher who wanted a slim bride and got a curvy one instead. About how the right person won't ask you to be less than you are, but will love you for being exactly yourself. About how sometimes the best things come from getting what you didn't know you needed." "Tell her about the broken bed," Samuel suggested with a grin. "That's the best part." She laughed, the sound filling their room with joy. "Maybe when she's older, some stories need the right audience." As they prepared for bed in their sturdy oak frame that had weathered 5 years without a creak, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that awful day at the train station to this night of perfect contentment, every step had been worth it. "I love you, Margaret McKenna," he said as they settled in for sleep. "My strong, capable, bed-breaking wife. And I love you, Samuel McKenna," she replied. "My wise, adaptable, finally sees clearly husband." Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in the vast Montana sky, keeping watch over the McKenna Ranch, where a man who'd wanted one thing had received something far better: a love story worth telling, a partnership worth having, and a life worth living. The old saying was true: be careful what you wish for. Samuel had wished for a slim, obedient bride and had instead received Margaret, fierce, strong, unconventional Margaret. The West had a way of giving you what you needed rather than what you wanted. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you learned to want what you needed. As sleep took them, the big oak bed held steady and strong, built to last, just like the love it sheltered. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Leave a comment below and let us know. We'd love to connect with listeners from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Samuel and Margaret's journey. Did their story touch your heart? We'd love to hear what you think.